Hey friends, welcome in. My name is Chris. I'm in my garage. These are my thoughts. Welcome to Garage Thoughts. After everything that happened in 2024, after the soul searching, the losses, the autopsy, about what went wrong and how to reach people who tune them out, you would think the Democratic Party would be desperate for new voices, new energy, new ways of reaching the young, the disaffected, the people who stayed home or voted third party or just didn't see the point in voting anymore. So why in April of 2026 is the biggest controversy inside the Democratic Party not Trump threatening to wipe out an entire civilization on social media, not the illegal Iran war, not the economy cratering, not the ongoing dismantling of federal institutions, but a Twitch streamer stumping for a candidate in Michigan? Because it isn't new. It isn't a 2026 problem. Hell, it's not even a social media problem. The Democratic establishment has been doing this for over 130 years. Let's get into it. First, what actually happened, because it's worth understanding clearly before we zoom out. Hasan Piker is a Twitch streamer and political commentator with over 3 million followers on Twitch, nearly 2 million on YouTube, and millions more across other platforms. He's a self-described Marxist. He is the nephew of Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks, and he has built the largest left-wing media audience in the country, primarily among young people who don't watch cable news and don't read political newspapers, and are, by and large, exactly the Democratic Party has been hemorrhaging. Abdul El-Sayed is a progressive physician and former Detroit health director running in the Democratic primary for Michigan's open Senate seat, one of the most competitive races of the 2026 cycle. He invited Hasan to campaign with him in April. They held rallies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and at Michigan State in East Lansing. The Democratic establishment's response to this was immediate and overwhelming. Representative Brad Schneider called Hasan Piker an unapologetic anti-Semite. Senators Alyssa Slotkin and Senate candidate Haley Stevens piled on. Mallory McMorrow, El-Sayed's primary opponent, compared Hasan Piker to Nick Fuentes, the white nationalist. Senators Cory Booker and Ruben Gallego both told Politico that they wouldn't go on Hasan Piker's stream. CNN ran lengthy segments, and the Wall Street Journal published an op-ed from a corporate centrist Democrat group called Third Way, warning that the party was getting too cozy with him. And now I want to be honest with you here, because that's what this channel is about. Hasan Piker has a history of inflammatory statements. In 2019, he said that America deserved 9/11. That was taken, of course, out of context. At face value, that can be a crossed line that reasonable people can criticize. That's real. I'm not going to pretend that it isn't. But here's the question I want you to hold alongside that. The same cycle that the Democratic establishment drew a hard line at Hasan Piker, the same cycle where Cory Booker said he would never go on that stream, these are people from a party that supports Gavin Newsom, who went on podcasts with Charlie Kirk, Steve Bannon, Michael Savage, people with their own complicated histories in massive audiences. When the audience is on the right, apparently you can hold your nose and go. When the audience is on the left, you call a smear campaign. What exactly is being protected here, and from whom? That is the question that takes us back 130 years. Now, before we go to the history, I want to establish something about the present. We watched, literally last week, a man named Peter Magyar defeat Viktor Orban in Hungary. He ended 16 years of entrenched authoritarian rule. If you haven't seen my last video, go watch it, but the short version is this. Magyar did not beat Orban by running towards the center. He did not win by triangulating or moderating or trying to seem safe and palatable to the establishment. He won by building a coalition of people who were ideologically diverse and united around economic grievances. He outpopulisted the populist. Now let's look at what's happening here. Hasan Piker's platform reaches millions of young Americans who did not engage with traditional Democratic Party media. Some of them did not vote in 2024, and many of them are exactly the voters the party needs in Michigan, a state where Trump flipped, in a Senate race that could determine the Senate majority. In the party's response to a candidate trying to reach those voters, is to publicly humiliate him and declare the streamer radioactive. Here's what I keep going back to. Like I said, one of the Democratic frontrunners in Gavin Newsom went on podcasts with Ben Shapiro. He was there with Charlie Kirk, Michael Savage. Those audiences are fine. Apparently, you can expand the coalition and go where the voters are, but a left-wing audience, their own voters, that is where they draw the line. Now, I'm not telling you what to think about Hasan Piker. I'm just asking you to notice the pattern of who gets the benefit of the doubt and who does not. Because this pattern, this specific pattern of the Democratic establishment shutting the door on its own left flank is not new. And history has something very specific to say about what happens when they do it. Now, let's go back to the 1890s. The United States is in the middle of what historians call the crisis of industrial capitalism. Railroad monopolies control entire regional economies. Corporations have consolidated power to a degree that makes the word competition meaningless. Wealth is concentrated in the hands of a vanishingly small number of people. Workers have no protections. Farmers are being crushed by debt and exploitative pricing. And a corrupt network of political machines in both parties ensure that the people with money stay in control of the people making decisions. Does that sound familiar? I will wait. Into this environment steps William Jennings Bryan. Bryan is a Nebraska congressman, an order of almost supernatural power. He believes in the working class, in the farmer, in the ordinary American being crushed by concentrated economic power. He believes the Democratic Party should stand for those people and those people alone. He calls out the conservative, pro-business wing of his own party, the so-called Bourbon Democrats led by President Grover Cleveland, and says they have abandoned the people the party was supposed to represent. In 1896, he delivers one of the most famous speeches in American political convention history, the Cross of Gold speech. He tells the assembled Democrats that the working people of America shall not be crucified upon a cross of gold, meaning the gold standard monetary policy that favored creditors over debtors and bankers over farmers. The crowd goes absolutely insane. He wins the nomination on the 5th ballot. Now, the establishment's horrified. They call him radical, they call him dangerous, toxic, and they say that he will destroy the party. Does this sound familiar yet? He did lose the election in 1896, in 1900, in 1908. Now, service level analysis, you can kind of leave it there and say, well, he lost, these ideas don't work. But here's what they do not tell you. Bryan moved the Democratic Party. His decade of pressure from the left eventually forces the party to adopt positions on labor rights, corporate regulation, the direct election of senators, and economic justice that it would never have touched without him. He lost 3 presidential elections, but he still won the argument over a decade. The establishment spent nearly 20 years trying to suppress what Bryan represented, and what he represented was millions of Americans with legitimate economic grievances who had nowhere else to go. Now, let's talk about Eugene Debs. While Bryan works inside of the party system, Debs built the Socialist Party outside of it. He is a labor organizer who believed that American capitalism had fundamentally failed the working class and that the two-party system was designed to prevent any meaningful change. He ran for president 5 times. In 1912, at his peak, he won nearly 1 million votes, which was almost 6% of the electorate. In a 4-way race against Woodrow Wilson, William Howard Taft, and Theodore Roosevelt, Debs pulls nearly 1 million people who looked at the available options and said, none of the above, I want the socialist who actually represents me. Now, the Democratic establishment's response to that, did they ask what 1 million Americans voting socialist represented? Did they examine the economic conditions that were driving people to a candidate explicitly outside of the two-party system? Did they engage with the legitimate grievances underneath the movement? No. When Debs opposed American entry into World War I in a speech in Canton, Ohio against the draft in 1918, Woodrow Wilson's administration prosecuted him under the Espionage Act and sent him to prison. He ran his 1920 presidential campaign from a jail cell and still received nearly 1 million votes. They did not understand the movement. They just locked the guy up. And then there's Robert La Follette Sr. of Wisconsin. La spent decades as the pressure valve from the left inside of the Republican Party, fighting railroad monopolies, demanding direct democracy, pushing for labor protections, calling out corporate capture of the political system. Both parties treated him as an embarrassment for most of his career. He was too radical, he was too loud, and too inconvenient. In 1924, with nowhere left to go, he ran as a third-party progressive. He won Wisconsin outright and won nearly 17% of the national popular vote. 17%. Because the left had been suppressed and excluded and condescended to long enough that when somebody finally opened a door, millions of people walked through it. Now let's fast forward 100 years-ish. Let's go to 2016. Let's go with Bernie Sanders. Now, the Democratic establishment by 2014 had really cozied up to the idea that Hillary Clinton's turn was now. It was her race, and everybody worth their salt in the Democratic Party establishment really recognized that, and she was going to basically run unopposed all the way to the nomination. But in stepped Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Socialist Independent senator from Vermont, introduced millions of young, disaffected people into the political system by pushing for progressive policies such as Medicare for all, a $15 minimum wage, a livable wage, ending the endless wars, and maintaining a populist viewpoint. What did the Democratic Party do? They smeared him endlessly, and they used superdelegates to suppress his run and eventually handed the party to Hillary Clinton, which eventually handed the White House to Donald Trump. That was 10 years ago, but that miscalculation from the Democratic Party is still costing us today. Now, all of that being said, these are different eras, different men, different specific issues, but the same establishment response. You marginalize, discredit, exclude. You call them dangerous, call them liabilities, act as if the energy they represent does not exist or simply does not matter. In the same result every single time. The energy does not disappear. It either gets absorbed eventually and translated into policy, or it walks out the door and hands power to the other side. The New Deal, Social Security, labor protections, banking regulation, the entire architecture of the American middle class only happened because Franklin Roosevelt finally absorbed nearly 40 years of suppressed progressive pressure and turned that into governing policy. He did not create that energy. It had been building since Bryan's Cross of Gold speech. He just finally listened to it. The establishment spent nearly 40 years trying to manage and suppress the pressure, while FDR spent 12 years riding it into one of the most consequential governing periods in American history. Why is this specifically counterproductive right now, you might ask? Well, here's why this specific pattern is so dangerous in this moment. We are not in a normal political environment. We are facing what historians of Democratic backsliding have identified as a genuinely authoritarian populist movement. One with institutional ambitions, their own media ecosystem, and a blueprint borrowed explicitly from Viktor Orban's Hungary. Against that, the Democratic Party is going to need the broadest possible coalition. Every voice that reaches people they can't reach, every door that opens to voters that have tuned them out. And instead, they are spending political capital on a Twitch streamer. Let me tell you what beats authoritarian populism. We just watched it happen in Budapest. You don't beat it with triangulation and careful positioning. You beat it by going where the voters are, by speaking to economic realities in language that people actually understand, by building a coalition that is broader and more energized than the one you are up against. Peter Major did not win because he was safe. He won because he had unified his coalition rather than policed them. The Democratic establishment is doing the opposite. They are shrinking their coalition in a moment that demands expansion. They are relitigating internal ideological disputes in a moment that demands progress. And they have done this before for 130 years with predictable results. And now I want to be careful here because intellectual honesty matters to me. The progressive era movements I described did not all succeed. Bryan lost 3 times. Debs went to prison. LaFolette's third-party run did not help anybody get elected. The suppression of the left flank had consequences, but so did some of the left's strategic choices. But Hasan Piker is not Eugene Debs. The Michigan Senate race is not the 1896 Democratic Convention. But the pattern, the establishment's reflexive move to shut the door on left flank pressure rather than engage with what it represents, has a track record. And the track record says it does not make the energy go away, it just determines whether that energy works for you or against you. Right now in Michigan, in a race that could determine Senate control, the Democratic Party is choosing to make it work against them. They are bringing a strongly worded op-ed in the Wall Street Journal to a gunfight. Now, let me be clear about what I am arguing here. I am not arguing that Hasan Piker is beyond criticism. He isn't. Nobody is. I am not arguing that the Democratic Party should have no standards or no lines. It should. I am not arguing that reaching left-wing audiences is more important than reaching persuadable voters in the middle. Coalition building is complicated in both matter. But what I am arguing is this. There is a difference between having legitimate concerns about a specific figure and using those concerns as a pretext to shut down left flank energy that you find inconvenient. And the Democratic establishment has a 130-year track record of doing the latter while claiming the former. There is a difference between criticizing inflammatory rhetoric and refusing to engage with the millions of people that rhetoric has reached. People with legitimate economic grievances, people who felt abandoned by the system, and people who need a reason to show up for the Democratic Party in November. And there is something specifically self-defeating about a party that needs to expand its coalition in this moment of genuine democratic crises, choosing this week of all weeks to make who can campaign with whom the central controversy of its primary season. The progressive era taught us that suppressed political energy does not evaporate. It builds, and it eventually finds a home in your coalition or it burns the house down on its way out. The question for the Democratic primary right now is the same question it has been asked since William Jennings Bryan took a convention stage in 1896. Are you going to absorb this energy and use it, or you're going to keep shutting the door on your base and wondering why nobody shows up? Michigan matters. It's one of 4 genuine Senate toss-ups in 2026. The winner of the Democratic primary faces a competitive general election in a state that Trump flipped in 2024. The stakes of getting this wrong are not abstract, they are real. And November is not that far away. I started this channel because I believe that history has things to tell us about the present that most news coverage does not take the time to explain. That the patterns underneath the noise are often more revealing than the noise itself. And the pattern underneath the Hasan Piker controversy is not really about Hasan Piker. It's about a party deciding again whether to engage with the energy of its base or suppress it. Whether to ask what millions of disaffected young people represent or just call them liabilities. Bryan asked the Democratic Party to stand for the people being crushed by concentrated economic power, and that party spent 20 years fighting him before finally absorbing what he represented. Debs went to prison rather than be silenced. 1 million people still voted for him from a jail cell. La Follette took 17% of the country to the third-party ballot line because they had nowhere else to go. And 40 years after Bryan's Cross of Gold speech, FDR built the New Deal, the most consequential expansion of American economic justice in the country's history, on the foundation of all that suppressed progressive energy finally finding a home. The Democratic Party has always had a left flank. It has always been uncomfortable with that left flank, and it always eventually has to reckon with what the left flank represents. That reckoning is happening again, right now, in Michigan, with a Senate seat on the line right before our eyes. And how they handle it will tell us something about whether they've learned anything from the last 130 years. I doubt it. But what do I know? I'm just a guy in his garage. My name is Chris. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I will see you next time.